Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere. A little noisier, a little messier, and a lot less forgiving than the quiet room you're in right now. This is history for sleeping. And if you're new here, this is your place for long, slow, boring history for sleep. A place where the past unfolds without hurry, where the sleepy historian in me tells you stories meant not to excite, but to ease you toward rest. Tonight we step into the Roman Empire, not as a senator, not as an emperor, but as just another person trying to make it through one full day without getting lost, fined, sick, or worse. We'll move through narrow streets, crowded baths, and crowded courts. We'll meet a Parthian princess who vowed not to comb her hair until victory was hers. We'll follow the hum of bees from ancient Egypt to the hills of Rome. And finally, we'll walk the polished floors of Roman villas and the worn stones of their back alleys. If you enjoy this kind of quiet journey into the uncomfortable truths of history, feel free to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly want more of this history to fall asleep to. And maybe let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always oddly comforting to imagine who else is drifting into sleep beside us. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin. Slowly. You don't open your eyes because of bright light, but because something else slips in first. The sound of Rome, just as the day begins to stir. There is no alarm clock, only the thud of footsteps on thin wooden stairs, the crow of a rooster filtering through layers of walls, and the dry grind of wooden wheels rolling over the stone street below. A morning here does not begin like in the films. No golden sunlight pouring in, no balcony overflowing with green leaves. Only a pale gray light, slipping through a window no larger than your hand, where it has to wrestle with dust and smoke to reach the room. You lie there a while, feeling the thin wool blanket already damp with the night's dew. The bed is not a sturdy wooden frame, but a simple structure stuffed with pressed straw, mixed with bits of chaff and small scraps. When you turn, there is that familiar dry rustling beneath your back, a sound you know well, but never like. The smell is a mixture of damp mold and cooking smoke from the floor below, with something else. Faint, hard to name, perhaps the lime wash on the walls, yellowed with age. The ceiling is so low you can touch the beams when you stand. The wood has darkened over the years, soaking up winter moisture and breathing out a musty scent whenever the weather changes. The rough stone walls are bare, patched here and there with fresh mortar. In the dimness, a few cracks run like old veins, mingling with blackened spots from smoke of winters past. Footsteps sound in the corridor outside, followed by the slam of a door, a sound you know well enough to guess its owner by the rhythm. A child cries somewhere, its wail quickly drowned by a sharp, rapid scolding in Latin. The smell of bread from the communal oven below drifts upward, warm, slightly burnt, slipping in through the cracks along with the chill of early morning air. Beside the bed sits a small clay jar of water, not cool like from a deep well, but water left overnight, carrying the faint taste of iron from the vessel. A cheap wooden comb lies tipped on its side, a few teeth already broken. And in the corner, the clay chamber pot, silent but impossible to ignore, since every morning it must be carried down to the street drain. You rise slowly, without hurry. After all, nothing here opens before the sun itself. Each movement reminds you of how small this space is. Two people standing here at once could hardly turn around. This is the third floor of an insula, a Roman tenement where each higher floor is less certain than the one below. You've heard of ceilings collapsing just because a neighbor upstairs dropped a jar of oil. And though you've never seen it, you believe it could happen. Stepping to the small window, You lift the cloth that hangs as a curtain, not to admire the view, but to see if the street has begun to stir. The gray stone road below is already waking. A fish seller squats beside a wooden tub, knife flashing as he slices salt-cured meat. An old woman drags a cart piled with wild greens. A thin dog noses through the rubbish heap. These sounds are not exactly noise, more like the bass rhythm of the city. Steady, familiar, unavoidable. The morning air carries a damp scent from the Tiber, mixed with the smoke of stoves being lit. Now and then, a stronger gust brings with it a sour edge, perhaps from the public drain, where the whole street sends its offerings. Newcomers wrinkle their noses. Those who've lived here long treat it as part of the morning. You turn back inside, pull on a tunica faded with age. The coarse cloth hangs loose, its weave still rough in places where it scrapes the skin. You tie the belt around your waist, feeling the fine dust of the fibers fall away. A sign it's old, but good for another season. In the corner, your leather sandals are worn thin, straps fraying but not yet broken. You slide your feet in, and the chill of the stone floor seeps up instantly. From the third floor down, the narrow staircase leans slightly, every step releasing a small creak. The stairwell walls are so close you could touch both sides with your arms spread. The only light comes from pale streaks slipping through a door crack below, casting everything in a dusty gray. From time to time, you step aside to let someone pass with a water bucket, or a neighbor hugging a basket of fresh bread. Stepping out of the insula, the daylight stings your eyes at first. Not from brightness, but from the contrast after the dark room. The street is still wet from night dew, stones slick in places. The cry of a vendor drifts up from the far end, blending with the steady rhythm of hooves on stone. A group of slaves passes by, carrying a huge jar, likely wine for a wealthy domus nearby. You move aside to let them pass, then rejoin the slow current of people heading toward the forum. A Roman morning is never completely quiet. Even when the city still feels drowsy, there is always a background hum, wind slipping through narrow alleys, pigeons cooing on the roofs, water dripping steadily from a gutter into the jar beneath. Each morning, you step into that rhythm. Not hurried, but never too slow. Here, a new day doesn't begin with coffee or sweetbread, but with leaving your small room, joining the flow of a vast city that has been moving long before you opened your eyes. And as your steps fall into the cold morning stone, you know you are about to live through another day, exactly like yesterday, and every day before. You step out from the narrow alley where your insula stands, carrying a clay jar covered loosely with a wooden lid. It's not heavy, but each step reminds you this is the first task of the morning, and one no one escapes. There is nothing private about it. In Rome, even the most personal needs are dealt with in the place where everyone deals with them together. The stone-paved street is brighter now. The first shafts of sunlight slip between roof tiles and tall buildings, scattering patches of light among shadows. You walk carefully, avoiding the stones still slick from the night's dew. The fruit seller's morning call mingles with the metallic clatter from a blacksmith's forge, forming a wordless rhythm, occasionally broken by the quick roll of a passing cart. You know the way to the nearest latrina, a long row of stone seats with round openings, just a few alleys from the market. On the way, you pass small shops just opening, a sandal maker setting out his goods, a wine seller pouring samples for a customer. No one pays you any mind. Everyone here has carried a jar like yours, in the morning or in the evening. The latrina's doorway appears ahead, not large, but recognizable by the stone wall stained from years of watermarks. A few people are already inside, chatting idly as if seated in a tea house. You step in, the coolness of shade wrapping around you. Along both walls runs a single row of joined stone seats. Beneath them, a shallow stream flows, carrying away whatever needs to be carried away. There are no partitions, no doors. Each person sits only an elbow's width from the next. You choose an empty space at the far end and set your jar on the floor. The sound of water merges with the low murmur of two merchants on your left, discussing the price of olive oil this week, utterly unconcerned with what their bodies are doing. In front of you, at knee height, runs another narrow channel of water, holding a few long wooden sticks tipped with darkened sponges. These are the tersorium, the shared cleaning tool of the latrina. After each use, it is dipped into a bucket of salted or vinegared water, then placed back again. Here, the idea of shared feels different from the world you once knew. Nothing in this space belongs to anyone alone, not even cleanliness. You go about your business quietly, avoiding the gaze of the old man opposite you. Chewing an olive, his eyes still fixed in your direction as though this were a casual meeting. The room's scent is hard to name. Damp stone, salt water, and a lingering haze from dozens of different breakfasts. Not unbearable, but never something you'd call pleasant. When you're done, you use the tersorium, a compromise between clean and not, enough to continue the day. The chill of the salted water wakes you fully, and perhaps that is part of why the Romans have never bothered to change this method. Cheap, simple, and long since familiar. You wash your hands at the communal basin by the door. No soap, just running water from a pipe, cool but faintly metallic. Drops fall onto the stone floor with a steady plop, mingling with the shuffle of leather sandals and the low hum of conversation. Stepping back into the street, you breathe in deeply. Even tinged with dust and the scent of cooking food, the morning air outside feels far better. You carry the rinsed jar, heading home or perhaps onward to work. The latrina itself is nothing you think much about, only another part of the daily rhythm, like going to market or drawing water from the well. Newcomers may find the place strange, even unsettling. But to a Roman, the latrina is both public and familiar, a spot to trade goods, hear news, or simply rest in the shade for a few minutes before stepping back into the bright, crowded streets. And so, one of the most private acts becomes a kind of social ritual. Simple, repeated, and hardly inconvenient to anyone, except those from another world, like you. Leaving the latrina, you step into the small square where a few stalls have already begun to set out their goods. Not to buy, but to pass through. You're used to the fact that your morning won't offer much choice. The first meal in Rome isn't seen as important. It's more like a small ritual to line the stomach, just enough to keep the body moving, nothing more. You follow a stone-paved street toward a public fountain where neighbors are already gathered. Some are filling jars, others are standing and chewing dry bread. That bread, panis rusticus, is not soft, not fragrant, not the kind you might find in a modern bakery. It's a solid loaf baked the day before, dense and heavy, its crust hard enough to test your teeth. Inside, there's no airy crumb, only a close, damp mass, speckled with bits of grain left unground. From a cloth bag, you take out a piece and bite off a corner. It makes no sound like the bread you've known, neither a crisp crack nor a gentle give, but a packed firmness that forces you to chew until the dough slowly breaks down. The taste? A faint sourness from the ferment, a hint of bitterness from the well-baked crust. Not bad, but it carries none of the start-the-day warmth of a modern coffee. From a small pouch, you bring out a clay flask of what Romans often drink in the morning. Diluted wine. Not the sweet, heady sort served at feasts, but a common wine, cut with water to soften the bite, and safer than drinking the water by itself. The first swallow slides down cool, leaving a slight tannic edge. Here, that's normal. Children and adults alike drink it, knowing well that well water in the city may hold things you don't want to swallow. If you're lucky, there might be a bit of hard cheese. Not smooth like modern cheese, but crumbly, salty, and strong smelling. Or a few black olives, cured in salt so long the flesh is soft, but still clings to its stone. These are rare treats for the morning. Most days, bread and watered wine are all there is. You sit on the stone step by the fountain, eating slowly. Around you, others do the same, standing, sitting, talking, or keeping silent. No one seems in a hurry. Breakfast here is not a time for gathering or lingering, but a small pause between two things that must be done. What makes you realize you're in another world isn't just what's on the plate, but what isn't. No coffee, no tea, no white sugar, no pastries, no butter, no aroma of cafes opening early, no hot paper cup in your hand. Instead, there's the smoke from someone's hearth, the scent of salted fish from a nearby stall, and the restless sound of a city opening its eyes. You take another bite, feeling the dry crumbs cling to your gums. Someone passes by carrying a small tray of hot chickpea fritters, the smell drifting toward you. For a moment, you're tempted to trade your breakfast away, but the lightness of your purse reminds you that today is not a day for spending more. In Rome, a commoner's breakfast rarely changes. Simple, repeated, enough energy to begin the workday, not something to savor. When the bread and wine are gone, you stand, brush the crumbs from your hands, and drink a small swallow of water from the fountain. Not much, just enough to rinse away the tannin's edge. And that's it. Breakfast ends as quickly as it began. No one here says, "Enjoy your meal," or "See you at lunch." People simply rise, return to their business, leaving the square to other footsteps. You blend back into the crowd, the faint warmth of wine still in your throat, the sound of leather soles scraping softly over stone. The day has truly begun. And you know tomorrow's breakfast, and many mornings after, will be exactly the same. Breakfast over, you set the empty jar and cloth bag in their usual corner near home. There's no time to linger. The city is already moving like a vast machine, and you are just one small gear in it. The street from your neighborhood to the worksite is busier now, not so loud as to be chaotic, but full enough that every step must avoid someone or something. You are not a merchant, not a writer, not a lawyer. Your work is the kind Rome needs most and replaces fastest: manual labor. Shoulders, arms, and legs that carry, dig, hammer, split stone. The strength the city depends on, but rarely praises. Today, you've been hired at a construction site near the main square, not for a grand building of the emperor, but to repair the support columns of a public bath. Still heavy work, still under pressure to finish. When you arrive, several men are already waiting, leaning on shovel handles or sitting on stone steps to rest before starting. The overseer is a sun-darkened man of middle years, with a voice that could cut through the ringing of hammers. He doesn't shout without cause, but each order carries the weight of someone who knows time is money, and money waits for no one. Here, being a few minutes late can cost you the day's pay. You take your tool, a wooden shovel edged in worn iron, its handle slightly loose. Your fingers feel the smooth shine where hands have gripped for years, and the rough splintering near the end, marks from countless blows against stone. No gloves, so each firm hold leaves a layer of dry grit on your skin. Work begins. The scrape of shovel on soil, the thud of hammers on columns, the dry rhythm of wood and stone shifting. No one speaks much. Breath is saved for pushing and pulling. The sun is not yet strong, but the slanting light already brings beads of sweat to your forehead. With each hour, the weight grows on your back and shoulders. Dust from the site hangs in the air, settling on hair and clothing. When you glance upward, you see the particles glitter in the sunlight. Beautiful, but catching in your throat. It's not just the labor that's heavy, but the quiet competition. Everyone knows that if you work too slowly or make a mistake, someone else will be ready to take your place. Manual labor in Rome comes with no long-term promise, only a chain of days when you are called or not called. Having work today does not mean you will have it tomorrow. The mid-morning break is short. Some eat the last piece of bread from earlier. Others drink a swallow of water from a leather flask. You do the same, sitting on a stone step, your back against a column, feeling the ache in your muscles shift into a dull, spreading numbness. Around you, quiet talk, the clink of tools from another section, and farther off, the cry of a street seller. In the afternoon, the sun tilts lower, but the work doesn't ease. Lifting a large block of stone, you feel your muscles stretch like ropes, and every movement must be careful. One slip, one roll in the wrong direction, and it could injure not just you, but the man beside you. Here, injury is a private matter, not always met with compensation or care. You remember the stories from neighbors, someone falling from scaffolding, someone crushed under a weight, and then vanishing from the site. No one says exactly what happened, only that they weren't hired again. In a city as crowded as Rome, there is always someone ready to replace you. When the overseer calls an end, your body feels heavier. The tools are stacked away, stone dust drifting down as you brush your tunic. No bonus, no thanks. Just a nod, meaning you've done enough to be paid today. Walking away from the site, you feel the day's weight still on your shoulders, not just in muscle, but in your thoughts. Work in Rome, for someone like you, is not about achievement or glory. It is only about getting through today and hoping there will be work again tomorrow. The workday is done, but the day itself is not. From the construction site, you step onto a broader street, where everything seems to move in different directions at once. Rome at this hour is no longer a city of quiet alleys or empty squares. It becomes a living network, always in motion, chaotic, yet carrying its own rhythm. The sound of carts is the loudest of all. Wooden wheels bound with iron roll over paving stones in a steady thrum, sometimes giving a sharp squeal when leather brakes bite down. The drivers, in short cloaks, shout something in Latin you only half understand, urging their horses through the crowd. The animals breathe hard, their warm breath mixing with the strong, musky scent of sweat, folded into air that already holds too many smells. You move closer to the raised curb, where the stones are set a little higher to keep you clear of the drainage channel running down the middle. This is where everything, rainwater, wash water, and other things, flows away. Its smell drifts up whenever a light breeze passes, mixing with the smoke from a meat stall on the corner, and faintly, the scent of fading flowers in a peddler's basket. Vendors in Rome don't stay fixed in one spot. They weave through the streets, carrying trays in hand or balancing poles across their shoulders. One sells small golden fritters, another calls out salted fish, another shows just a few pears in a woven basket. Their cries overlap without pattern, yet somehow you learn to pick out the sounds you want to hear. In the thick of the crowd, you step carefully to avoid colliding with people carrying awkward loads. Someone with a water jar as tall as their head, someone hauling a roll of wool twice their size. Children dart through gaps between adults and carts, their laughter trailing behind them before they vanish into a side alley. You cannot walk fast here. Rome's streets force you to match their pace, a speed where everything presses together, yet rarely crashes hard. You learn to turn your body as a wine cart passes, or angle your shoulder to miss a fruit seller's basket. Sometimes you step down into the channel itself, just to make way for a line of slaves carrying the litter of a nobleman. The scene shifts with every stretch of street. Here, a red brick wall mottled with shadow. There, a carved wooden door ajar, showing a stone-paved courtyard with a pot of green plants. Every corner holds a story, but no one has time to tell it. As you move, your ears keep busy. The ring of a blacksmith's hammer on iron, the clink of pottery at the ceramics stall, the sharp voices of an argument spilling from an early open tavern. Together they form a kind of soundtrack no one composed, yet it has played here for centuries. Your eyes are no less occupied. Painted wooden signs outside taverns, a loaf of bread, a fish, for those who can't read the names. An old woman sits before her doorway, spinning yarn, her gaze lifting now and then toward the passing crowd, as if searching for a familiar face. Far off, the dome of a temple rises against the sky, catching the last light of the day. At one intersection, you have to stop. Two freight carts try to squeeze past each other while a group of children gathers to watch a street performer. He spins a brass ring around his wrist, singing as he balances on a chair with one leg broken. Passers-by drop coins into a bowl at his feet, then walk on as if they had never paused. You notice that in this chaos, Romans do not seek emptiness or silence. They have learned to live with noise, mingled scents, and crowded space. In that rhythm, they find their way, not by avoiding the crowd, but by sliding through the narrow gaps, like water between stones. At last, turning into the alley that leads toward the square where you'll stop before heading home, the roar fades behind you. Yet its traces remain, in the warmth of sunlight still on your skin, in the mix of hearth smoke and salted olives in your nose, and in the faint sound of wheels still rolling somewhere nearby. Rome does not fall silent, even when you leave the street. It only lowers the volume, waiting for you to step back into it tomorrow. After a day in the crowded streets of Rome, imagine stepping away, into another world, wider, drier, and quieter. No more red brick walls or western paving stones, but white stone palaces and sunlit courtyards of the East. Here, many centuries ago, a girl grew up among silk, gold, and stories of war. Her name was Rodogune, princess of the Parthian Empire. Parthia was not Rome. It stretched across a vast sweep of land, from the Iranian plateau to the fertile plains between two great rivers. It was a world of desert and mountain, of trade roads so long it could take weeks to travel just one stretch. The palace where Rodogune lived rose in one of the empire's capitals, perhaps Hekatompilos, perhaps Ctesiphon, where camel caravans brought silk from the east, and merchants arrived from the west with wine and glass. Her childhood was not only days of running through stone-paved courts or memorizing ancient songs. From an early age, she was surrounded by the whispers of advisors, the debates of envoys, and maps spread wide across the great wooden table in the council room. Her father, a king or high prince of Parthia, did not raise his daughter to learn only the domestic arts. In his eyes, Parthia needed people who could defend it, and gender was no barrier when the empire stood ringed by threats both within and without. In the mornings, as the sun touched the palace domes, Rodogune often sat in the open chamber facing the rose garden, listening to her tutor in diplomacy. She learned the weight of eye contact, the patience to wait for an invitation before sitting, and how to recognize a hidden threat in a sentence that seemed entirely friendly. She memorized the names of kings and princes from distant lands, learned to recall the banners and symbols of each court, so she would never appear ignorant before an envoy. In the afternoons, as the shadows lengthened across the courtyard, she watched the drills of the cavalry, the most formidable force in Parthia. From the high colonnade, she saw war horses in light armor tear across the training ground, arrows loosed from the saddle without breaking stride. The art of shooting while at full gallop, the skill that struck fear into Rome, was no secret to her, at least in theory. And sometimes she would step down into the yard, take a light bow in hand, and draw the string until her fingers burned red. Rodogune also studied the history of Parthian wars, victories over the Seleucids, battles with neighboring kingdoms, and defeats that sent tremors through the court. She listened not to glorify triumph, but to understand that an empire's borders were not fixed lines on a map. They shifted with each generation, and a single wrong decision could see a city lost in a single season. Beyond war, she was trained in the subtler arts of rule, the governance of the court itself. She followed her mother or other royal women into private audiences, where the most powerful women in Parthia spoke of political marriages, family alliances, and how to keep their influence steady as fortunes changed. In Parthia, royal women might not wear the crown, but their voices could turn the will of the council. Though raised in luxury, Rodogune was not shut away. She saw tribute bearers arrive, clothes dusty from the road, eyes holding both hope and fear. She heard words of praise, but also caught the quiet muttering of resentment as they stepped away from the red carpet. Moments like these taught her that power was a double-edged blade. It could force the head to bow, but it could also make people dream of the day they would stand upright again. For her, the Parthian palace was at once home, school, and training ground. Long corridors hung with low oil lamps, stone steps worn by thousands of feet, walls painted with scenes of battle, all became part of her memory. Outside, the empire changed with each day. Inside, she prepared for a role that no one dared to name aloud, but everyone quietly knew. At an age when many princesses in other kingdoms thought only of marriage, Rodogune could read military maps, understand reports from the frontier, and sense the danger when an envoy arrived without tribute. Such preparation was no accident. In Parthian history, times of crisis had often produced unexpected leaders, and her court could not dismiss the possibility that one day she might be among them. On the rare quiet evenings, when the courtyard held only the sound of water from the fountain, Rodogune would sit alone, breathing the wind that carried the scent of sand and resin from distant mountains. Perhaps then she did not know that an oath would one day bind her name to history. But all she had learned, diplomacy, strategy, horsemanship, and the silent art of observation, was already preparing her for that moment. The years of Rodogune's learning and observation passed within a palace that seemed unassailable. But even the thickest walls could not stop news from slipping through. This time it came from the west, from lands the court's maps shaded in pale gold to mark belonging to Parthia. Though in truth, loyalty there shifted with the seasons. The western provinces stretched across fertile valleys and cities once ruled by ancient kingdoms like Media and Babylonia. They were crossroads where Mediterranean goods met silk and spices from the east. But wealth had never brought them peace. Whenever the court's attention was pulled toward other frontiers, the local nobility tested how far their control could reach, sometimes openly, sometimes with more subtlety. This time, it began not with battle, but with signs almost invisible to the casual eye. First, a few cities delayed sending their tribute. Then came whispers that certain officials could no longer be reached. Merchants murmured that the gate guards in Media no longer wore Parthian insignia. And one morning, word swept through the palace corridors. A western border fortress had raised its own banner, declaring it no longer answered to the capital. The reasons, as usual, were many. Part of it was taxes, rising year after year to feed the armies on the eastern and northern fronts. Part of it was the pride of local nobles who remembered when they ruled without sending word to a court thousands of miles away. And among it all simmered the quiet resentment of ordinary people, trapped between feeding both the rebels and the royal troops. But deeper still, the true danger was not in the rebel troop counts or their storehouses. It was in geography. These provinces sat astride the route that kept Parthia's east and west connected. If the west fell, the empire would be split in two. Caravans would be forced onto long detours through desert or mountain, slowing everything from tax collection to military reinforcements. In the royal council, the generals argued without pause. Some urged sending a large force at once to crush the rebellion before it grew. Others warned that marching an army without care would leave other borders exposed, and Parthia had no shortage of enemies waiting for such a chance. The envoys produced lists of the families behind the revolt, each name a diplomatic knot that could take months to untangle. Rodogune was not invited into these closed councils, but she caught fragments in the corridors, or from servants letting slip details as they poured wine. From these scraps, she pieced together a wider picture. The West was not merely resisting the crown, it was testing the very structure of Parthian power. Left too long, it would be an invitation for other regions to follow. Threats to the throne were not abstract to her. Parthian history had its share of rebellions that turned into struggles for the crown. A noble with enough strength and enough cities at his back could declare himself king, forcing the royal house to either acknowledge him or fight. For Rodogune, princess, daughter of a dynasty now under trial, that was not only a political risk, but a personal one. With each passing day, news from the west became sharper. Merchants arriving in the capital spoke of rebel checkpoints on the roads. Royal envoys were turned back or returned empty-handed. Some neutral cities began storing grain, preparing for the possibility of siege. In the capital's markets, people whispered that if the West succeeded, Parthia would no longer be the Parthia they knew. In the evenings, Rodogune would stand on the balcony and face the setting sun, toward the lands in revolt. From here, all was still, but she knew that out there, preparations were underway for events that could decide the fate of the entire empire. It was not just about losing territory, but about losing the belief that the throne could shield all it ruled. And in that heavy air, of news half true, of eyes holding both fear and resolve, Rodogune began to feel the time for learning had passed. The storm was near, and it would wait for no one. In the early days of the uprising, the court was still divided. Some generals pushed to march at once, some officials urged negotiation, and others counseled only to wait. But in the great hall, between the tall columns and the soft gold light spilling from the oil lamps, a voice rose, not that of an old general, nor of a long-seated prince, but of Rodogune. She used no flourished speech. She spoke only the truth all present already knew. If the West slipped away, the empire would lose more than land. The reverence for the throne would fracture, and when that happened, borders would mean nothing. Then, before the council's silence, she made a vow, strange in form, but heavy with meaning. She would not comb, braid, or touch her hair until the rebellion was crushed completely. In Parthian culture, a royal woman's hair was a symbol of grace and authority. To keep it glossy, perfumed with scented oil, and drawn smooth with ivory combs, was a daily rite. To refuse it was to declare that all luxury, all the courtesies of court, would be set aside for duty. When her vow was spoken, all knew it was no show of vanity. Each day she went without touching her hair would be a reminder, to the army and to the enemy alike, that the campaign was not yet done. Preparations moved quickly. No grand parades, no farewell banquets. Rodogune chose simplicity. A few hundred elite cavalry, several infantry units, and a light supply train. Baggage was cut to the minimum to preserve speed. On the morning of departure, a pale mist lay over the palace court. The first light touched the horse's armor, casting brief glints across the stone. Rodogune wore light mail, a long cloak in muted color thrown over it. Her hair, once smoothed each morning, now hung loose, unchanged for now, but all knew that if her vow endured, it would grow into a symbol none could ignore. She did not ride in a chariot, but on horseback at the head of the column. Her warhorse, chosen from the finest Parthian stock, stepped steadily through the gates. On either side, the townspeople stood silent, many bowing their heads, some pressing a hand to the chest in the mountain people's salute. No voices cried out, but the air was dense with gravity. The road out of the capital took the army through wide fields, fresh from harvest, and over open lowlands where the wind moved unbroken. Day after day, the column stretched forward like a living ribbon, hoofbeats mixing with the creak of wagon wheels and the low talk of sentries. Rodogune was no figurehead. She inspected the horses, asked after the food stores, and sat with her officers to hear the scouts' reports. At night, by the firelight, she was among the soldiers, never on a raised seat or beneath a separate canopy. The tale of the princess who would not comb her hair spread faster than her orders. In every loyal town and village they passed, people came out to greet them. They brought water, bread, and hay for the horses. They also brought news of rebel patrols, of roads safe or unsafe. Rodogune listened to all, sometimes only nodding, sometimes signaling for an officer to take note. Her vow was no longer just a matter for the court. It became a story carried from market sellers to sentries on the walls, that in the east, a woman rode with unbound hair to lead the army against rebellion, and that she would not comb it until victory. Through the long days of travel, her hair began to bear the mark of the oath, strands loose, ends caught by the wind, the courtly shine fading. But that change only fixed her image more firmly in the soldiers' minds. They saw her endure wind, dust, and hardship as they did. In the hardest moments, that sight was reason enough to keep moving. As the army neared the edge of rebel territory, the fields gave way to narrow roads between hills and riverbanks. This was no longer mere travel, but entry into land where every village and bridge could be a rebel watchpoint. Rodogune ordered tighter patrols, yet kept the pace swift. The morning of departure was far behind, but its meaning, the vow at the gates, the steady resolve, marched with her still. And with every mile forward, both the oath and the campaign moved closer to the true test. The West did not greet Rodogune with a pitched battle. As her army entered rebel-held territory, they found empty roads, shuttered villages, and cautious eyes watching from afar. The enemy knew they could not win in a single open clash, so they chose to remain unseen, appearing only when advantage was theirs. Rodogune did not hurry. She had learned from long hours of observation in the palace that victory did not always come from the swiftest blow. Sometimes it came from wearing the enemy down before the sword was ever drawn. The rebel cities had high walls, strong gates, and stocked granaries. A direct assault would cost too many lives. Instead, Rodogune ordered her forces split into small groups, moving like streams of water to encircle each city in silence. Supply lines were cut first, then the relay stations. Rebel horses vanished in the night, and food convoys never reached their destinations. She made full use of the Parthian cavalry, archers on horseback who could strike accurately even at full gallop. They did not pursue to destroy every enemy band. They appeared without warning, loosed a storm of arrows, and slipped away into the morning mist. By dusk, they might reappear from another quarter, so the rebels never knew which direction was safe. This wore down more than their stores and numbers. It wore down their spirit. A city under siege knows not only hunger, but fear. Each distant hoofbeat might herald a sudden raid. Each day without supplies meant smaller rations and sharper quarrels within their own ranks. Rodogune knew that keeping her own soldiers steady was as important as exhausting the enemy. In camp, she walked between the rows of tents at night, speaking with soldiers about their families, the lands they had passed, listening to stray complaints about rations or saddle straps, and having them fixed when she could. She made sure they saw her living under the same conditions. Her hair, now beginning to tangle and thicken with dust and wind, stood as a visible testament to her oath. Anyone who looked knew she was not seeking comfort for herself while the work remained undone. For each city, a siege might last weeks. Camps were set at a distance safe from arrows, yet close enough for constant watch. By day, cavalry patrolled the perimeter, blocking every road out. By night, guards rotated to keep the ring unbroken. When a city's resolve began to waver, Rodogune sent envoys with terms. She did not waste words on empty threats. She gave a clear choice: open the gates and live, or hold out and starve. Many chose to yield, knowing that prolonging the fight would only bring suffering to their own people. Some, however, clung on. There, she tightened the siege further, cutting even the water if necessary, yet avoided needless ruin. She knew these cities would still be needed as part of the empire when the war was done. Her officers noted the difference in her command. She pressed not for speed, but for steadiness. She sought not the quick victory that brought fame, but the certain victory that secured lasting peace. For the rebels, each day inside the walls was another day hope thinned. For her own troops, each day was proof of their endurance. When at last a city's gates swung open, there was no great cheer, only the heavy tread of hooves entering, and the long creak of hinges unused for months. But Rodogune knew. As long as one fortress still held out, her vow was not yet fulfilled. And her hair, now part of the story itself, still hung unbound beneath her helm, a quiet but steadfast banner, following her through each city, each siege, until all was silent again. The season had turned. Mornings in camp were colder now, the breath of horses and men alike drifting into the air like smoke. The siege around the final fortress, where the rebel leaders had withdrawn and held fast, had tightened day by day, week by week, month by month. It was not a broad city of winding streets, but a single mass of stone set high on a hill, overlooking the plains like a watchful eye. Rodogune knew this would be the campaign's final test, not only of strength, but of patience. She gave no rallying cries, no orders for a reckless assault. Instead, the ring drew in slowly, like a hand closing around something small. Each day, a watch post moved nearer, a hidden path was sealed, a patrol strengthened. The soldiers had grown used to this rhythm, enough pressure to keep those inside uneasy, but not so much that those outside wore themselves down. And, as through the entire campaign, Rodogune's hair still hung long, now heavier, thicker, darker from dust, sun, and time. Anyone who saw her ride past the lines knew, as long as it went uncombed, the war was not yet done. As the fortress stores dwindled, the first sign of surrender was the thinning of the cooking smoke. Then one day, the rebel banner was lowered, replaced by a white cloth lifting in the wind. There was no great cheer, only a quiet exhale that spread through the camp. Rodogune ordered the gates opened, the prisoners taken in, and those who had not borne arms allowed to leave. In the fortress yard, she stood for a time, looking up at walls now stripped of their use. This was more than the fall of a stronghold. It was the end of an entire wave of defiance. With this fortress gone, there was no longer a center from which rebellion could be fed. News of victory moved faster than the army. As Rodogune and her soldiers returned toward the capital, cities along the way opened their gates in welcome. People brought bread, wine, water, and greetings that months before had been cautious. The soldiers came home with lighter steps, yet carried the discipline of long months on campaign. And then came the day many had awaited, the day Rodogune would keep her vow. She chose not to do it in her private chamber, but in the palace's great courtyard, where soldiers and citizens alike could see. Large basins of water were set out, scented oil placed on a wooden table, and the ivory combs brought forth from the place they had been stored since before she left the capital. She sat on a plain chair, unadorned with gold or silver. The attendants began to untangle each strand, matted by dust, sweat, and time. With every stroke of the comb, a fine powder fell away like another kind of mist. Those gathered stood in silence, not because the act was ceremonial, but because they knew they were witnessing a vow kept in full. The combing took time, unhurried. As the oil soaked in, the hair softened and shone again, yet still carried the deep color of months on the field. When the final knot was freed, Rodogune rose, no crown on her head, but with a presence that left no one thinking of another in her place. This victory did more than restore order in the West. It strengthened the power of the throne, and of Rodogune herself. In the soldiers' eyes, she was one who had shared their hardships. In the people's, she was the image of a promise kept. To the enemy, she was proof that Parthia could not be easily shaken. In the months that followed, Rodogune did not withdraw into the shadows. She took part in reorganizing the western provinces, appointing loyal officials, and setting measures to prevent another outbreak. She visited cities once under siege, not to parade her triumph, but to ensure they knew Parthia had returned, not as an occupier, but as a center of power they could not do without. The story of the princess who would not comb her hair spread across the empire's lands and beyond its borders. Merchants told it in western markets, envoys spoke of it in eastern courts. With each telling, the details shifted. Some said her hair reached her heels, others that it had turned silver under the sun. But the meaning never changed. It was a story of discipline, patience, and leadership shown through action rather than words. Rodogune asked for no statue, no inscription. She let the legend live in the memory of those who had seen it. And, like all legends, it became part of Parthia's own identity. A reminder that sometimes a single personal vow can stand as the emblem of an entire empire. If you leave behind the dry deserts of Parthia and its dust-laden battlefields, you might let yourself drift along another river, the Nile, into an age when the pyramids were still new and the temples still heavy with the scent of incense. There, among countless scenes carved on tomb walls and stone tablets, is one image often overlooked, yet carrying a rare, quiet calm: the beekeepers. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of rhythms, the rhythm of the annual flood, of planting and harvest, of the sun rising and falling over the desert. Within that rhythm, bees and honey found a steady place. Not loud like the hammer of the stonemason, not grand like the rites of sacrifice, beekeeping lived as part of daily life, and, in a subtle way, as part of the bond between people and the gods. Tomb paintings at Saqqara and elsewhere show Egyptians bending over stacked clay cylinders, blowing soft smoke into a small hole at one end. The smoke calmed the bees, and the beekeeper could lift out the comb without destroying the hive. This was no passing invention. It was the product of generations of watching, adjusting, and finding a way for bees and people to share space without driving one another away. Egyptian hives were often made of clay, long and cylindrical, laid horizontally in rows. They could be moved easily and stacked like bricks. That mattered, because Egyptians did not keep their bees in one place all year. They practiced a kind of seasonal migration for the hives, loading the clay tubes onto boats and moving along the Nile in step with the flowering of plants. When the floodwaters receded and the fields bloomed, the bees were brought there. When the flowers faded, they were taken to other regions. It was a form of resource management, almost like military strategy. Rather than letting the bees rely on a fixed food source, beekeepers brought them where nectar was always fresh, keeping the colonies strong and the honey yield steady. It happened quietly, with only the dip of oars in water and the hum of bees under the sun. But honey was more than food. In ancient Egypt, it was the sweet liquid of the gods. One legend told that when the sun god Ra wept, his tears fell to the earth and turned into bees, and the bees made honey to nourish humankind. Honey was thus an offering in temples, used to anoint statues of gods, or mixed with wine and aromatics for ritual use. It was also part of Egyptian medicine. Medical papyri record hundreds of remedies using honey to heal wounds, soothe the throat, or preserve herbs. Its natural antibacterial power, not explained by their science, but known through long practice, made it one of their most valued medicines. Even politics touched the hive. The bee was once the emblem of Lower Egypt, the northern kingdom, and the title, He of the Sedge and the Bee, was given to the pharaoh to mark his authority over both lands. Bees were not only in kitchens and apothecaries, but in the way Egyptians thought about kingship itself. If you picture a beekeeper's day in Egypt, it begins early. Before the heat sharpened, they would check each clay tube, listening for the sound within to judge the hive's state. Smoke from slow-burning bundles of twigs and leaves was blown through the opening. Its scent mingled with the warm smell of wax. The combs were taken not for immediate eating, but to be left to drip into sealed ceramic jars, keeping in the fragrance and keeping out the ants. It was not a loud craft, but one of patience and care, qualities the ancient Egyptians valued deeply. And in the dry heat of the desert, those thick golden drops of honey were both a practical reward and a sacred one. In Egypt, beekeeping never vanished. It adapted and endured, and even now, along the banks of the Nile, there are keepers whose methods echo those of their ancestors. That continuity is like the hum you might hear on a quiet afternoon. Gentle, persistent, and unbroken across thousands of years. If you leave the Nile and drift eastward, past low mountains and wind-dry plains, you reach the wide basin of the Tigris and Euphrates, the land the ancients called Mesopotamia. Here stood the first cities, the wheel, writing, and laws carved into stone. And among those things that seem hard and dry, there ran a quieter, sweeter thread: beekeeping and honey. Unlike Egypt, where the craft appears clearly in tomb paintings, Mesopotamia left its traces mostly in writing and in law. On clay tablets impressed with cuneiform, beside the tallies of taxes, land deeds, and barley harvests, there are occasional lines about bee gardens or honey as regulated goods. The people of Mesopotamia even wrote bees into the law. In the Code of Hammurabi, among the oldest legal codes known, there are clauses on the beekeeper's responsibilities and the right to protect their hives. If a man's bees damaged another's field, he owed compensation. If someone stole honey, the penalty was not only repayment, but sometimes an added fine in silver. That honey appears here at all shows. It was no luxury for the elite alone. It had become part of the daily economy, a product valuable enough to guard by law, like barley or livestock. The Mesopotamians also distinguished honey's uses. At the household level, it sweetened food and drink, and preserved perishable goods. In medicine, it was mixed with herbs and oils to make ointments for wounds, or blended into beer as a tonic. In ritual, honey was an offering in temples, especially in ceremonies for agricultural gods and the city's patron deity. Some records describe it being poured over sacrificial bread or into small jars set before the god's statue. In Mesopotamian thought, honey was a middle product, born from nature but tended by human hands, and so it symbolized cooperation between people and the divine. Beekeeping here may not have ranged so far as in Egypt, but it still required watchfulness. It is thought they used baskets or reed cylinders coated with clay as hives. These were placed at the edges of gardens or near irrigation canals, where seasonal blooms kept the bees supplied. Picture a morning on the outskirts of Babylon or Ur. Light mist over the barley rows, water moving slowly through the channels, and in one garden corner, a few hives lying still in the pale light. The keeper approaches, tapping the hive wall lightly to hear what's within. If the hum is strong and even, the colony is healthy. If faint or broken, there is cause to add feed or seek the trouble. They left few depictions of this work, but archaeologists have found ceramic jars bearing traces of wax and honey, evidence that beekeeping and honey preparation were present here at least as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. And bees did not live only in the material world. They appear in certain symbolic passages. In some myths, the bee is the one who knows the way, a nod to its gift for finding and returning to the hive without fail. From this, bees sometimes served as metaphors for loyal followers or trustworthy envoys. Wherever you stand in this land, on the walls of Ur or beside the canals of Nippur, ancient Mesopotamian beekeeping shared one truth with Egypt's. It was not showy, not loud, but steady, woven into both economic life and the spiritual fabric. And if you listen closely, you can almost imagine the hum still there, a soft undertone in the long music of the world's river-borne civilizations. If from the land between the Tigris and Euphrates you head northwest, across limestone valleys and low mountain ranges, you will come to Anatolia, a broad, high plain where the sky seems to stretch without end. Here, in the 2nd millennium BCE, the Hittites built a kingdom both strong in war and intricate in ritual. And among their store of symbols, laws, and beliefs, the bee held a special place, not only as a source of sweetness, but as a creature of cleansing power, linking the visible world to the unseen. The Hittites left no carved reliefs of beekeeping as vivid as Egypt's, but in their ritual texts impressed onto clay tablets, the bee appears plainly. Here it was not a background figure in the harvest, but the main actor in purification rites, an essential thread in Hittite religious life. One ancient text describes a priest seeking to remove impurity, which might mean illness, misfortune, or the trace of a curse, from a person or a community. In the rite, a bee is called forth with a spoken invocation, entrusted with the task of carrying away all that is harmful, then set free to fly from the village or the city. The thought was simple. The impurity clung to the bee, and the bee carried it away, restoring balance to the people and the land. The image shows how the Hittites saw the bee, not merely as a creature of spring, but as a messenger between humans and invisible forces. Its speed, Its unerring sense of direction, its sudden vanishing into the air, made it the perfect symbol for carrying a burden or a message from one realm to another. Of course, the bee still held its practical role, making honey and wax. Anatolia's varied climate and terrain offered it many sources of nectar, from open steppe to grain valleys to hillsides thick with fruit trees. Though no direct evidence survives of Hittite hive designs, scholars believe they may have used clay tubes or woven reed baskets, much like their neighbors. But the most distinctive part was the spiritual meaning. For the Hittites, purification was more than cleansing the body or the ground. It was restoring the order of the cosmos. They believed the world held together by a fragile balance, and that what was unclean, whether physical, moral, or spiritual, could unsettle it. The bee rite was a way to return harmony through a small, tireless creature both familiar and mysterious. You might picture such a ceremony on a spring morning, a clear sky, the smell of cut grass mixed with the smoke from a slow-burning bundle of herbs. The priest stands within a circle of people, holding a small basket with the bee waiting inside. The prayer rises steady and measured, like an old song everyone knows. Then, at the chosen moment, the basket opens. The bee lifts into the air, its hum fine and distinct, circling once above the gathering before vanishing toward the horizon. The Hittites must have known a single bee could not truly carry away anything tangible. But the rite, the trust, and the image were enough to ease the mind, bind the community together, and affirm that all was returning to its proper place. Beyond purification, bees and honey also appeared in offerings. Honey mixed with wine might be poured over sacrificial bread or placed in small ceramic jars as gifts to the gods. In seasonal festivals, honey stood for the earth's reward and the sky's gift, sweet, rare, and won through labor. Wax held its own value. It was shaped into candles and lamps for night rituals, when light was more than a tool for seeing, but a sign of divine presence. Beeswax burned clean and steady, casting a calm glow fit for moments requiring focus and reverence. If in Egypt and Mesopotamia, beekeeping was bound closely to the economy, in Hittite Anatolia, it was equally bound to the spirit. Here, bees did more than make honey. They performed an invisible duty, keeping the world clean and balanced, at least in the minds of those who trusted in the power of their small wings and familiar hum. And if you were to walk the old roads across the Anatolian plain, where dry grass bends in the wind beneath a deep blue sky, you might still hear bees somewhere nearby, a sound small but unwavering, like their place in this land's history, humble, enduring, and impossible to replace. If from the Anatolian plateau you travel southwest, you will meet the Aegean, a deep blue sea threading between islands and peninsulas the ancient Greeks called home. Here, the bee was more than a source of honey. It was a subject for philosophers, poets, and the stories of myth retold over generations. And when the Roman Empire spread outward, it inherited that legacy, weaving beekeeping into an economic network that spanned a continent. The ancient Greeks watched bees with a special curiosity. Aristotle, philosopher, naturalist, spent long hours studying the structure of hives, the work of the laboring bees, and the place of the queen. He recorded not only his observations, but his thoughts on how bees navigate, how they divide their labor, how they tend their young. Though later science would correct parts of his understanding, what endures is the patience and detail of his attention, showing that bees were valued not only for food, but as a model of an ideal society, ordered, cooperative, persistent. Greek hives were made of fired clay, sometimes built in sections that could be opened to take honey without destroying the whole nest. It was a step beyond the practice of many other cultures, allowing the colony to go on producing instead of starting anew each season. When the time came to harvest, dry leaves were burned to make smoke that calmed the bees. Then the comb was lifted gently, and the honey strained through coarse cloth into ceramic jars for storage. In daily life, honey was the main sweetener. Cane sugar was not yet common, and it found its way into many dishes, stirred into yogurt, spread on bread, or mixed into wine to make mead. In culture, the bee and honey held a deeper meaning. Many temples, especially those of Artemis and Demeter, saw the bee as sacred. The priestesses of Artemis were sometimes called Melissa, the bee, evoking purity, diligence, and closeness to nature. Myth placed the bee in moments of inspiration. One tale says the god Apollo sent bees to teach humankind the making of honey and mead. In another, Pythia, the oracle of Delphi, was once called the bee of Delphi, linking prophecy to the ordered, tireless work of the hive. When Rome rose and absorbed Greek influence, it took the bee into its own economy and culture. Roman agricultural writers like Varro and Columella described in detail how to keep bees, where to place hives, how to guard against disease. They used many materials for hives: fired clay, hollow logs, or woven willow baskets coated with mud. This variety reflected how the craft adapted to many climates and terrains, from damp Italian hills to the dry plains of Hispania. The Romans harvested honey and wax on a larger scale, enough for trade. Honey was not only for eating and drinking. It served in medicine as a preservative and mixed with herbs to make ointments. Beeswax was an important material for candles, for writing tablets, and for waterproofing vessels and tools. In Roman culture, the bee often stood for diligence and order, values the state wished to see in its people. Some Roman military units even used the bee as their emblem, a reminder of teamwork and disciplined force. Imagine a day in the Roman countryside at honey harvest, rows of hives set along a stone wall, facing south to catch the morning sun. The keeper moves from hive to hive, smoke in hand, listening to the pitch of the hum. To them, it is not noise but a sign of life, a small community working without pause. In the world of Greece and Rome, bees and honey were more than agricultural products. They were part of a worldview. A healthy hive was proof of balance between nature and human care, between labor and reward, between order and freedom. And perhaps, as the sun lowered and the hum faded, the beekeeper sitting before the house with a clay jar full of honey felt a quiet satisfaction, the contentment of a season complete. Another turn in the long rhythm of life that bees have shared with humankind for thousands of years. Looking back along the path bees have taken through the ancient world, from the Nile to Mesopotamia, across the Anatolian plateau, and onto the harbors of Greece and Rome, one constant stands out. Bees were never only insects that made honey. In the minds of the ancients, they were a living emblem of order, cooperation, and a kind of sweetness that belonged not just to the tongue. In Egypt, the bee was bound to kingship. The emblem of sedge and bee stood for the pharaoh's unified power over both Upper and Lower Egypt. In religious rites, honey was offered to Ra and other gods as something pure, close to the nature of light and the sun. The Egyptians believed honey could sweeten not only food, but the favor of the divine. In Mesopotamia, the bee rarely appeared in image, but it lived in law and trade, as property to be protected, as a commodity of value. Cuneiform tablets list honey as a taxable good, something to be exchanged for barley, wool, or oil. It had crossed the threshold from household need into the wider economic system. The Hittites saw the bee through a spiritual lens, a creature to carry away impurity, to restore balance between people and land. In their purification rites, releasing a bee was more than a symbol. It reinforced the belief that even the small could guard the community. In Greece and Rome, the bee entered both science and myth. Philosophers studied it as a model of an ideal society. Poets wove it into tales of prophecy and the art of living in harmony with nature. In daily life, honey was the essential sweetener, an ingredient in ointments, and a constant presence in festivals and sacrificial rites. Beyond its symbolic role, honey held a secure place in ancient medicine. The Egyptians recorded hundreds of recipes using honey, mixed with milk and herbs to soothe the throat, spread over wounds to ward off infection, blended with oil to soften the skin. They may not have known its antibacterial nature in chemical terms, but generations of experience proved its worth. The Greeks and Romans continued the tradition. Hippocrates, often called the father of Western medicine, recommended honey mixed with vinegar as a cleansing drink, and honey with flour for healing sores. In the Roman army, honey served as a field antiseptic and as a quick source of energy for soldiers. Beyond medicine, honey was a strategic trade good. In Roman times, rural districts devoted to beekeeping supplied the cities, where demand was constant. Honey and wax traveled by river and sea, woven into an intercontinental trade network. Beeswax, waterproof and malleable, was used to seal pottery, to make writing tablets, and to craft ritual objects. In the ancient world, bees and honey were at once food source, spiritual symbol, medical tool, and economic unit. They stood at the meeting point of nature and civilization, between the tangible and the unseen. If you picture the end of a honey harvest in a Greek or Roman village, you might see ceramic jars lined neatly in a storeroom, late sunlight falling across the gold of the comb. The beekeeper washes his hands in a basin, the scent of honey still clinging to the skin. The hum has faded with the coming of dusk, but in the quiet air, their place is undiminished. And so, across thousands of years, bees have kept their special place in human memory, not only for the sweetness they give, but for the image of a small, steadfast, and bound community, reflecting what people have always wished for their own societies. If you are used to the cramped, low-ceilinged insula apartments and the constant noise of Rome's working-class quarters, imagine a different kind of morning, one belonging to a wealthy patrician family living in a domus or a villa. There is no arguing neighbor through thin walls, no mingled smell of refuse and kitchen smoke. Instead, there is a stone-paved courtyard, a small pool in the center catching the light, and the steady sound of water spilling from the bronze mouth of a dolphin statue. The home of the elite was not only spacious, but arranged as a stage for status. Entering through the vestibulum, the formal entryway, a guest would pass into the atrium, an open-roofed central court where sunlight and air poured in. The floor was often set with fine mosaics, sometimes telling mythological tales or recording the victories of the owner. Walls were painted in deep red, yellow, or blue, adorned with frescoes of landscapes or still life. Beyond the atrium lay the triclinium, the main dining room. This was the setting for evening banquets, and in ancient Rome, a banquet was never only about eating. It was politics, diplomacy, and the weaving of alliances. Guests did not sit in chairs, but reclined on couches arranged around a low table. Dishes came in courses, from starters like olives, boiled eggs, and bread dipped in oil, to mains such as grilled fish, lamb, or pheasant, and desserts of fruit, honey, and pastry. The space was warmed with lamplight, perfumed with flowers and incense, and filled with the sound of lyre or flute played by slaves. Between courses, the host spoke with guests, raising matters of politics or even marriage alliances to bind families closer together. Clothing was another form of declaration. Men wore the toga, a great draped garment of wool, pure white for ordinary citizens, edged with purple for senators. Women wore the long stola, with a palla cloak when outdoors. The fabric might be fine wool or imported linen, and at times dyed with the rare Tyrian purple, a color bound to royalty and the highest rank. Jewelry served both beauty and display. Gold, silver, emeralds, and pearls came from across the empire: Spain, Egypt, Persia, even India. A patrician woman might wear bracelets, necklaces, and hairpins, all crafted with skill. Men wore less, but a single large ring, often engraved with a family seal, was constant. Political power in Rome's upper class came not only from wealth, but from the ability to hold public office, something closed to most commoners. Patrician families often kept Senate seats for generations. Male members might become consul, quaestor, or governor of a province, positions that brought prestige and expanded influence beyond the reach of an ordinary citizen. Country villas were another sign of fortune. They were not simply summer retreats, but centers for managing estates. Vast tracts of land produced grain, wine, and olive oil, essentials for the empire. The owner might not live there year-round, but a steward oversaw the work of slaves and laborers. Yet, even in such comfort, the elite lived under strict codes of honor and duty. To host lavish banquets, to build a fine house, to wear costly garments. These were not only for personal enjoyment, but to maintain and project the family's image. For them, luxury was not a sin, so long as it served the greater aim of securing their place in the structure of power. And when night fell, a villa on the Roman outskirts might be so quiet that you heard only the water in the courtyard pool or the wind moving through the olive trees. It was a world far removed from the crowded, noisy insulae, a world where wealth, power, and beauty blended not only in material life, but in the very architecture of Roman society itself. If the evenings of Rome's elite often ended in lamplight and the gentle sound of strings, elsewhere in the city there were courts in session, or sentences being carried out. Roman law was famous for its system and precision, but it did not apply equally to everyone. Your place in society, citizen, foreigner, or slave, largely determined what you could do and how you would be judged if you broke the law. For Roman citizens, especially freeborn men of Rome or those granted citizenship, the law offered certain protections. You had the right to a trial, the right to appeal to higher authority, and in some cases, protection from humiliating punishments. A citizen, for example, could not be crucified, a sentence reserved for slaves, rebels, and the non-citizen condemned. If executed, a citizen might be beheaded instead, quicker, and considered less dishonorable. But that shield was not absolute. For treason, sacrilege against the state gods, or acts that threatened the empire's security, the law could be just as severe with a citizen as with anyone else. For slaves, the law did not see them as persons with rights, but as property. They could not sue, and could not defend themselves in court without their master's intervention. If a slave killed a master, the law decreed that every slave in that household could be put to death, a message meant to terrify. Punishment for slaves was often public, from flogging in the marketplace to crucifixion outside the city gates. Public punishments served not only to penalize the guilty, but to etch the law into the memory of those who watched. In the squares, thieves might lose a hand, swindlers might be named aloud and whipped. Many sentences had the air of performance, a theater of state power, with the offender as a living example. Minor offenses, noise, dishonest trade, violating public sanitation rules, might mean a fine or forced labor, More serious crimes, murder, rebellion, blasphemy, could bring exile, confiscation of property, or death. In Rome, law was tightly bound to the state religion. Insulting the rites or refusing to worship the official gods could be seen as treason. Some trials carried both legal and ritual weight, with magistrates and priests presiding together. Yet the law was not always rigid. Those with standing and a wide network of allies could have sentences reduced or avoided altogether through political intervention. Those without such ties often bore the full sentence, sometimes made harsher to set an example. Picture a morning in the Forum, Rome's central square. The sun still low, a small crowd gathers at a wooden platform where the magistrate will read the judgment. The murmur of voices mixes with the steady steps of the guard. A man stands bound, head lowered. The sentence is read slowly so that all can hear. Then the punishment is carried out, not rushed, but in exact order, like a ritual of authority. For the Romans, justice was no abstract idea. It was something you could see, hear, and sometimes smell, a part of public life like the market or the parade. And it was this visibility, as harsh as it could be, that helped Roman law endure for centuries, fixed in the minds of citizens and all who lived under their rule. If Roman law kept social order through rules and punishments, the state religion sustained stability through ritual and belief. In the ancient Roman world, religion was not a private affair. It was everywhere, in the home, on the street, in the forum, even in the course of political meetings. The Romans believed in a wide array of gods, from the great ones like Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, to those who presided over the smallest details of life. There was a god of doors, Janus, a goddess of hinges, Cardia, a goddess of the hearth, Vesta, and even a goddess of the sewers, Cloacina. Each had its own domain, demanding proper ritual and the right honors at the right time. Within the household, a small shrine called the lararium stood in a central place. There, figurines of the lares, guardians of the family, and the penates, protectors of food and storerooms, were kept. Each morning, the head of the household or a slave appointed to the task would offer a little wine, flowers, or bread to secure the family's safety. The scent of incense mingled with the smell of baking bread, becoming part of the morning air. Beyond the home, Rome's cities were full of temples, great and small. A temple was not just a place to pray, but a community center, a site for ceremonies, gatherings, and even economic dealings. On festival days, the square before the temple bloomed with garlands, banners, and long tables for public feasts. People dressed in their best, slaves were given time off, and music and song carried through the streets. Roman festivals were varied and frequent. Some honored the harvest, like the Cerealia for the goddess Ceres. Some celebrated victory, like the Ludi Romani for Jupiter. Some marked the turn of the seasons, like Saturnalia, when the social order was briefly reversed. Slaves dined alongside their masters, gifts were exchanged, and laughter drowned out the day's usual formality. But Roman religion was not limited to the traditional gods. As the empire grew, it adopted and Romanized foreign deities: Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia. These cults drew large followings, especially among soldiers and merchants, weaving a layered tapestry of faith across the empire. At another level, religion was a political instrument. From the time of Augustus, emperors were honored as semi-divine, and at times as gods outright. Temples to the emperor rose across the provinces. To offer incense or wine at an imperial altar was not merely a religious act, but a public statement of loyalty. Imperial worship was staged in full public view, with processions, ceremonial music, and speeches praising the emperor's deeds. Busts or statues of the ruler stood high on a platform, a laurel crown on the head, surrounded by soldiers, priests, and civic representatives. In such moments, it was hard to tell where religion ended and politics began. And perhaps for Rome, the two had always been one. If you picture a great festival like Imperial Cult Day in a provincial city, a clear sky, streets strewn with flowers, the soft drift of incense from the main temple into the market, crowds gather at the gates, drums and horns sounding as the procession approaches. At the front, men in white togas carry garlands. In the center, the emperor's statue rests on a crimson-draped platform. Behind, ranks of soldiers march in perfect step. When all stop before the temple, the priest pours wine onto the stone floor, a gesture inviting the divine to be present. Roman religion, for all its diversity and openness, kept to strict forms. A mistake in the rite, a word misread, an offering dropped, or a wrong date chosen, could mean starting again from the beginning. The Romans believed their gods noticed every detail, and that the prosperity of the community depended on keeping the rites exactly. For the ordinary person, religion was comfort and celebration. For the elite, it was also a tool of authority. And in the rhythm of Roman life, from a morning meal beside the family shrine to a grand festival at the emperor's temple, religion was woven into every moment, at once familiar and imposing, sacred and political. In ancient Rome, society was not a solid wall, but more like a long ladder, each rung polished by connections, wealth, and the recognition of others. At the top stood the emperor and his family, below them the senatorial class, senatores, then the equestrian order, equites, followed by the freeborn citizens, plebeians, and at the bottom slaves and freedmen, liberty. Each rung came with its own rules, opportunities, and clear limits. To climb upward, money alone was not enough. You needed a patronus, a patron. In Roman society, the patron-client relationship, patronus cliens, was the glue that held the system together. A patron might be a senator, a local magistrate, or a wealthy landowner. In return for loyalty, support in elections, and personal services, he would protect you, recommend you, or provide for you when needed. Every morning, the ritual of salutatio took place at the patron's home. Clients, clientes, lined up to be received, often dressed neatly, their expressions respectful. When their turn came, they bowed, offered blessings, or praised the family. In return, the patron might give them a task, to carry a letter, act as escort, or simply walk with him in public as living proof of his influence. Sometimes the reward was a meal or a small sum of money called the sportula. For the political class, the patronage network was not merely personal benefit, it was a tool to preserve power. A senator wishing to keep his seat had to maintain the support of dozens, even hundreds of clients. A wealthy businessman hoping to be admitted as an eques had to prove his influence and contributions to the community. But at every rung, there was pressure to hold one's position. A patrician family could lose its senatorial place if wealth declined or scandal struck. An eques could be stripped of rank for failing to meet the property requirements set by law. A plebeian without steady patronage or work could slip into poverty and even sell himself into slavery. In banquets, markets, and meetings at the forum, people watched each other, who was rising, who was falling. Rumors spread quickly, and a reputation could erode in a handful of whispered words. On the other hand, a well-timed recommendation from a patron could open a path from minor assistant to a seat on the local council. Even slaves could climb the ladder in their own way. Some were trusted with managing finances or business for their masters. If they excelled, they might be freed and become liberty, owing gratitude to their former master and continuing the patron-client tie in a new form. Picture a spring morning in Rome, stone-paved streets beginning to fill. Before the gate of a grand domus, a line of clients waits to greet the patron. The sound of sandals on stone, the low murmur of conversation, the scent of fresh blossoms from the garden nearby. When the gate opens, each steps forward in turn, offering words of goodwill, receiving in return a nod or a small purse. The scene repeats day after day, like the breathing of the city, steady, unchanging, yet always determining where each person stands on that invisible social ladder. In Rome, holding your place was not just about keeping your wealth, it was about keeping your network. That network was fed through exchange, not the open trade of the marketplace, but favors, promises, and presents. And in that world, sometimes a nod was worth more than a bag of gold. You have survived. Not on paper, not in a scene from a film, but in your own imagining, a full day in ancient Rome. You opened your eyes in a cramped insula apartment, walls damp, ceiling low. You felt the smell of mildew mixed with smoke slip into the room through the narrow crack of a door. You carried a clay jar down to the street, found your way to the public latrina, sharing space with strangers, with no trace of privacy. You ate breakfast on stale bread, watered wine, and sometimes only a single olive. No coffee, no sugar, nothing warm to soften the morning. You labored, building, hauling, selling, with rough tools and thin sandals that did nothing to keep stone and dust from your feet. You wove your way through narrow streets, avoiding carts, refuse, and the measuring eyes of passers-by. You breathed in air laced with the scents of flowers, smoke, fish, and sweat, a blend no one in this city noticed anymore. You heard of the powerful, those who lived in wide villas, dined reclining, wore white toga, and drank sweet wines from faraway lands. You learned of laws that split citizen from slave, and the public punishments that could bring an entire city to a halt to watch. You saw religion woven through everything, from the small shrine in a home to the great temples of the emperor, and understood that ritual was not just belief, but politics. You stood outside the circles of patronage, watching how people held their position through favors, promises, and simply being seen. And now, with the sun set behind the red-tiled roofs, you are still here, not crushed under a wheel, not seized for a petty crime, not laid low by fever or exhaustion. A single day survived. It sounds simple, but in ancient Rome, it was an achievement. Compared to the present, the gap is hard to measure. Now you can flip a switch and light floods the room, no waiting for the sun. You can drink clean water from a tap, not from a communal basin where dozens have just washed their hands. You can eat breakfast with hot coffee, eggs, fresh bread, without wondering if the loaf is 3 days old. You can reach your workplace without squeezing past horse carts and street refuse. You can send a message without waiting in a patron's atrium for an audience. But in exchange, you no longer have what Rome once assumed as ordinary. The sound of water trickling in an atrium fountain at dawn, the smell of fresh bread from the public oven, the sense of standing in a square full of statues and columns, knowing you are at the heart of an empire. The direct connection, unmediated by screens, from person to person, through a shared meal, a ritual, or a glance across a latrina. To live in ancient Rome meant accepting risks we now consider unthinkable. It meant never being certain you'd be well enough to work tomorrow. It meant always knowing your place in the system and keeping silent when needed. It meant no clear boundary between private life, law, and religion. The final question is, would you want to live that way? Not for a day, but for a lifetime. Not just the lively hours of the marketplace or arena, but the long, cold months of winter, or the hot, breathless summers when work was hard and illness lingered in every alley. You might say no, and that would be reasonable. But perhaps a small part of you, after imagining surviving one day in ancient Rome, would remember the slower rhythm, the tangible details, and the way life then could not be separated from community. Whichever answer you choose, Rome remains, not only in its stones, but in its laws, its architecture, and even the language you use now. A day survived in ancient Rome is a test of body, mind, and endurance. But it is also a mirror, showing that the comforts you have today were not always here, and that once, simply living through the day was itself a victory. And that's it. One day, in the life of an ordinary person in ancient Rome. From the damp straw mattress in a creaking insula to the marble columns of the elite. From public toilets without doors to dinners without dessert. From the soft hum of bees in temple gardens to the hard clatter of chariots in the streets. This is why we call it boring history for sleep. Because even in the most famous empire in the world, most lives were not battles or coronations. They were small, repetitive, and quietly exhausting. And yet, they were lives that carried the weight of history. You've listened through a full journey of history for sleeping. And whether you were here for every word, or drifted off somewhere between the Parthian siege and the Roman villa, that's perfectly fine. That's why this exists. A long, slow history to fall asleep to, told by your friendly, sleepy historian. As you turn off the light, or maybe you already have, remember that somewhere, far back in time, someone once looked up at the same moon you see tonight, and hoped simply to survive until morning. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.